Can you tell me about Rodney? How you would describe him?
My husband, Rodney, had an old soul. There was something about him where it seemed like he had been around for years. He just had a wisdom about him that was very special. Rodney was going to school during the day, and he was working at night. And one night, I called Rodney, and we talked on the phone about our day. And then we ended our call, as we usually do, with "I love you." And that was the last time I talked to him.
It's a slow Thursday night at the Wingate Inn, just 3 weeks before Christmas. Rodney Castellan, the hotel manager, is in the back office, crunching numbers. Carlos Torres mans the front desk.
Two men came quickly into the front lobby of the Wingate Inn together. One of these men came right at Carlos. He jumped the counter. He pointed a pistol in Carlos's face and demanded the money. Carlos opens the cash drawer, and he took the paper money out and handed it over. He turns away, and the guy strikes him in the head and says, "Where's the safe?" And that's when Rodney came out from the office.
The man continues to ask, "Where's the safe?" Rodney tells him there is no safe. And so he takes his .22 caliber handgun and shoots Rodney.
And flee. Carlos tries calling 911, but he panics and can't remember how to dial out. He runs to a nearby bowling alley to call for help. As police race to the Wingate Inn, paramedics try to save Rodney's life, but he's pronounced dead on arrival at Kennestone Hospital.
I was a forensic investigator assigned to the medical examiner's office. I received a call from the charge nurse at Kennestone Hospital. She told me that she wanted to report a death that had just occurred. The victim had been shot in a nearby business. When I arrived at the morgue, I saw the body of Rodney Castellan. The injury was above the nipple line on the left chest. That was, by its size and shape, consistent to me with a small caliber gunshot wound injury. I talked to a few of the detectives that were there at the Wingate Inn. There was some blood, and there were some papers thrown about on the floor, hotel documents that had been inside the cash drawer. The scene was telling us we were looking at one shot being fired. There weren't, at that time, a lot of clues or leads.
Him and his dad would watch the cars. And, I would be walking up the street, and Mr. Castellan was very intent on getting those cars clean. So, Rodney would be making funny gestures behind him, and things like that. So we would just bust out laughing.
Everybody liked him. I am very proud that I raised a good son. Very proud.
The summer of '91, I met Rodney. Instantly there was an attraction. It just felt like we were meant to be. We just enjoyed each other so much.
Rodney and Kelly make it official in April 1995. The following year, they welcome a son, Kyle.
Prior to Rodney and I getting married, he had 2 children already. And just very, very exciting to bring our families together. Our second child was Kennedy. Kennedy unfortunately passed away in 1999 from complications of a birth defect. I absolutely could not have imagined going through any of it without him. We did decide after Kennedy to have another baby. And so in 2000, I was pregnant. Rodney decided that he wanted to start a car wash. And so he went back to school into business management, and he was working at night. We were just settling into what we felt was new life for us, and we were happy. During my sleep, I thought I heard the doorbell. I opened the door, and it was Detective John Dawes, and he said, Kelly, there was a shooting and a robbery at the hotel tonight, and Rodney was killed.
The look in her eyes is something that I won't forget. All the things that she had talked about with her husband that they wanted to do just ended, and you can see it in her face.
I know in that moment when the robbers had that gun pointed to his face, I know for sure he was thinking of us. He was so good.
Kelly asked me, how long will this take? When will I know? We're at a stage in the investigation where we know that there was an armed robbery. We know that that gunshot caused Rodney's death. And that's about it. What can we tell this woman? How can I make the moment better? I answered the only way I knew how. What I felt in my gut. I told Kelly that night. I don't know when, but this case is going to be solved.
I don't think it's very often that a detective will make a promise to a victim's family that they will solve a case, because it's hard to keep.
I was drawn to Kelly in such a way that I had to keep track of this case. I was just the forensic investigator, handling certification of the death, but I knew the guys in homicide, and I was going to help however I could, do whatever I could.
Back at the Wingate Inn, crime scene investigators comb every inch of the scene.
The cash drawer was not only open, but all the paper money was gone. The money taken was $304.
Guns don't go off by themselves. And I think in this particular case, somebody had decided to bump up an armed robbery of some money, a little over $300, into a case of taking Rodney's life.
Nearby on the floor, over against the baseboard, there was a projectile. It was a small caliber. So that's what we were looking at.
Then the crime scene technician calls attention to the hotel's front counter.
On the registration counter, she used a flashlight and illuminated what appeared to be a left palm print and the fingertips associated with that palm. Some of them smudged, some of them not.
Prints aren't as easy to come by as people think they are. The next big hurdle is finding out who that print belongs to.
This is a hotel registration desk. How many people have touched that in the last day? It could be someone who just checked into the hotel. It could be the guy who took the money and shot Rodney. We don't know who this print belongs to.
A palm print and a projectile. It's not much to go on. Looking for more, detectives turn to the crime's closest eyewitness, the injured and shaken desk clerk.
In the interview with Carlos Torres, we were able to determine that we were looking for a black male. He was estimated to be 20 to 25 years of age, wearing a white jersey, perhaps with a number on it, but his face wasn't covered.
Carlos tells police he ran to the bowling alley in a panic, where he called 911. Investigators then discover there were 2 911 calls that night. One came from Carlos, the other from a hotel guest.
This hotel guest had gone into the computer room just off of the lobby that night, and while there, these 2 guys come running in the Wingate Inn. One jumped the counter behind the register and then shot Rodney Castleman. The other came directly at this hotel guest in the computer room. This suspect demanded the hotel guest get on the floor, empty out his pockets. This hotel guest described this guy as a black male, about 5'6", with a thin build, wearing a black face cover. So now we have the armed robbery of the hotel guest, and we have the murder of Rodney Castleman.
Detectives want to get a look at the unmasked suspect, but the hotel doesn't have security cameras.
There were detectives sent out to check all the businesses to see if they had cameras. We did hear from one of our uniform guys that earlier, about 3 to 4 hours before the armed robbery and murder at the Wingate Inn, the clerk from an Exxon station called and reported 2 suspicious males occupying a gray, early 1990s Lincoln Town Car. This store has video, and we want it. But the video is such poor quality. The pixelization was horrible. You couldn't have made out any facial features. The vehicle was never in a position where we could have gotten the tag number, so it didn't hold the value that we wanted. A couple of detectives went literally door to door throughout the hotel, waking people up, finding out how long have you been here, did you see anything?
Certainly, at a hotel, you're hoping that somebody may have been in the parking lot. They may have seen somebody flee.
Of all the contacts that were made, we were not able to gather any information from anyone. We have no idea where these suspects came from and in what direction they left in. I-75 is right there. In 10 minutes, he could be in Atlanta with 5 million other people. In an hour and a half, he can be in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Rodney's funeral was in Decatur. It was very emotional, that funeral, his funeral.
That was about the most saddest day of my life. God don't want to take the bad people's. They take the bad ones and the good ones. And they just took a good one from me.
The church was packed. Friends, family, people he worked with. And it's just a testament of who Rodney was.
"12 days after Rodney's murder, detectives don't have a single suspect. The killer could be anywhere by now. Investigators changed tactics.
Carlos Torres was brought to headquarters to try to do a composite sketch. After the sketch was completed, the parent company of the Wingate Inn, they had decided that they would include a reward of $10,000 on the case, leading to the arrest of the person who committed the armed robbery and the murder. So on December 19th, it hit the news. It's in the media, it's on television, in the metro Atlanta area. We're trying to locate any witness information that we can locate. This was a complete whodunit. Anytime the phone rings and a caller tells you that they want to provide information, it's exciting. There's potential there with every time the phone rings.
Tips can come in for the myriad of reasons. We've seen them come in where people are truly convinced they saw something that they didn't.
We got tips from men who were in custody in jails close to us. There were photographic lineups put together, but none of those lineups resulted in any identification by Carlos Torres.
By the new year, Cobb County investigators are hurting for leads and hang their last hope on the analysis of the print found at the scene.
We had eliminated fingerprints. It's not Carlos, it's not Rodney, it's not a hotel guest. So we had a good feeling that it was our guy. There were efforts made to identify that print through the ASFIS system, the automated fingerprint identification system. At the time, the system had been loaded up with a lot of fingerprints of people who had been in custody throughout the entire state of Georgia. We just didn't get a match at that time through AFIS.
I was calling multiple times in a day, trying to get answers. But what the detectives would often say to me is that these things can take time.
When you don't have the answers, it's very frustrating. I made Kelly a promise that Rodney's case would be solved. I was living with this case every day, wondering what else could be done.
I was mad after not even knowing who it was and didn't think that they would ever find out who did it.
We had been through quite the investigation. We had searched out everything we could, and there just wasn't anything coming through. So by September of 2002, everything had just stopped.
Just under 2 years after Rodney's murder, there are no suspects to question, no leads to chase, only a perfect print with no finger to match. Rodney's case goes cold in the Georgia autumn chill.
That's a sad day in the life of a homicide detective. My experience with armed robbery cases, they're just a very, very difficult case to solve.
It was discouraging, but I resolved myself to knowing that it would happen when it's supposed to.
There's not a day pass that I don't think about him. When I close my eyes at night, I can see him. And it's not a sad thing that I see. It's just a beautiful angel.
I went to my direct supervisor and I said, look, can I pull out some cold cases and start working on them?
Cold cases can't be solved by picking them up, laying them down, picking them up, laying them down. They can only be solved by picking them up and staying on top of them.
Rodney's case was the first one I pulled out of the file. Why? Because of Kelly Castleman. Still heard from her every now and then, but she still didn't have any answers. And I still felt horrible about it. I reviewed Rodney's case. I looked at every lead. I went back through the evidence and the fingerprints, trying to come up with some new way to go at the case. I still knew in my heart and in my gut that it would one day be solved. I'm in the office, and the intel analyst comes walking in the door, and he says, I got a teletype out of Florida. There's a person with information about an armed robbery and murder that occurred at a hotel that had Wynn in the name, and it occurred north of Atlanta 12 years earlier. I jumped out of my chair because my first thought is I'm about to solve this case. I flew out of my desk to grab the teletype. I need to find out everything I can about this person who's providing this information.
Detective Dawes gets in touch with the Florida deputy who sent the teletype that hinted at Rodney's murder.
So I'm talking to this deputy sheriff with Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, and he says, you know, I'm assigned to a federal task force about human trafficking. I was involved in a federal arrest with this guy. He's pending federal human trafficking charges here in Florida. His attorney provided a proffer, and the proffer was exactly what the teletype says. There was a murder north of Atlanta 12 years ago that I can provide information about.
Proffers come from individuals who are caught up in the criminal justice system. They're done so it will help them get a lesser sentence. In this particular case, this information that this person had offered to the state of Florida may be referring to the situation where Rodney had been robbed and shot in Cobb County, Georgia. The human trafficking case is still pending in the state of Florida, and based upon that, it limits Detective Dawes' ability to go talk to him.
This guy who had the information, he's represented by an attorney, so I can't ask him any questions. It's his constitutional right and guarantee, and I can't interrupt that, so I gotta sit and wait.
Prohibited by law to speak to the man in Florida while his human trafficking case is pending, Detective Dawes does some digging into his background.
He had been literally all over the United States, running prostitutes and taking money. So I get in touch with my fingerprint guy. Let's get this individual's prints and let's do a manual comparison to the print from the counter at the Wingate Inn. So that was done, no match.
After confirming that the print does not belong to the man in Florida, Detective Dawes remembers AFIS. The automated fingerprint identification system has evolved since 2000, when the prints found at the crime scene were first submitted for comparison.
In 2000, when you ran a print through AFIS, it was limited to looking at prints in your state. AFIS has now become a system where you can put a fingerprint in and see not only your state, You can see the entire United States.
And I said to my fingerprint guy, run the prints from the counter at the Wingate Inn. My fingerprint examiner came to me and he said, the left little finger, I got a match. And the guy's James Lorenzo Randolph.
Detective Dawes is finally able to put a name to the print, but the investigation is far from over.
Even though you may have matched the print, the truth is you frequently need a little bit more to make sure that case is prosecutable.
I could probably take a warrant at that time for James Lorenzo Randolph based on the print, but I wouldn't have felt comfortable saying, well, this guy's fingerprint is on the counter, so I think he did it, and that's all I got. I wanted to corroborate the evidence with a statement. I grabbed up Rodney's file and I found the hotel registration log and I looked for James Lorenzo Randolph. He's not on the guest log and he's not a previous or current employee of the Wingate Inn. I started my research on James Lorenzo Randolph. Within a week of Rodney Castle's murder, James Lorenzo Randolph was identified in an armed robbery of a sandwich shop in South Carolina. He was arrested in late December of 2000. He had done about 9.5 years in prison in South Carolina.
The lingering question for Detective Dawes is how James Lorenzo Randolph would be connected to the informant in Florida.
I see a report that in December of 2000, my person with information down in Florida and my fingerprint matched James Lorenzo Randolph listed the exact same address as their home address in Columbia, South Carolina. Now we're rolling.
Detective Dawes comes to a startling realization.
At the time of the incident at the Wingate Inn, the two men who came in were both described as thin builds. This guy who knows about the case is not a thin build, but how does he know about it? One thing that always bothered me about the Wingate Inn is we didn't know how the guys got there and we didn't know how they left. But they got out of the area quickly because somebody drove them there and somebody drove them away. The guy with the information in Florida, he's got to be a driver. I am itching to go to talk to this guy with information. I don't care where I have to go. I don't care how I get there. I want to know how he knows about Rodney's murder.
Knowing he has little chance of getting a statement from his main suspect, James Lorenzo Randolph, Detective Dawes stays focused on the man who may have driven the getaway car the night of Rodney's murder.
This guy with information in Florida had been sentenced for human trafficking, and he had been placed in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The fact that he'd been sentenced meant that he was no longer represented by an attorney, so I went to the prison where he was sentenced to serve.
Now legally able to speak to the suspected driver, Detective Dawes meets with him in federal prison, but gets nothing out of the tight-lipped informant.
It was very hard. It would just be like, what is it that it would take? What is it that we could do? It wasn't anything that we could do, but depend on the detectives.
As time continued to move, it was really important to me that my children grew up healthy and happy, especially with Kyle. I didn't want his memory to only be that someone killed his dad and for him to be angry. I wanted him to be happy. So I just continued to focus on that.
When I was elected the district attorney, we still had a number of unsolved homicide cases. I made a decision to approach John Dawes and talk to him about running our cold case unit. We put together a hand-picked, selected cold case unit.
This was kind of a passion project for Vic Reynolds. And so the men and women that he recruited, they were passionate about justice, and they had a heart for the victims.
In June of 2014, we opened up Rodney's case. We reviewed every police report. We had all these notes in this huge office. And I said, we have to do something.
Determined not to give up on the informant who wouldn't speak to him, Detective Dawes gets an idea. He reaches out to the Florida attorney who had represented the man in his federal human trafficking case.
And I said, can you tell me anything? And he said, well, clearly I can't tell you anything because I was his lawyer. But I bet if you offer him something, some benefit, he may talk to you.
We believe that this individual was involved in Rodney's case, but his involvement was limited to driving the getaway car. Do we tell them, in exchange for helping us get this shooter, we're going to make sure that you not be prosecuted for the offense of felony murder? It's a tough call, but that's what had to be made in this case.
Detective Dawes returns to the Terre Haute Federal Prison to speak with the informant again, who is still serving his sentence for human trafficking.
I handed him a letter signed by Vic that said, we won't charge you with any crime associated with this incident in the state of Georgia. But you have to give me your truthful statement.
You have to get on a witness stand in a trial, and you have to tell the truth in front of a jury of 12 individuals. That's what you have to do.
Very reluctantly, he began. One of the first things he said is, I won't tell you about the other guy. But he talked about driving, talked about James Lorenzo Randolph being in the back seat. The week before Rodney's murder, the SEC championship football was at the Georgia Dome, and he was running prostitutes. They were getting ready to leave town, and James said, let me hit that place, that Wingate. So they pulled up that night. He was parked in the Cadillac and could see inside. He saw Randolph holding the pistol. He saw him hit Carlos Torres with it. He saw him get the bag with money. He saw Rodney come out. He saw the gun being pointed. And then he saw the muzzle flash and knew that James Lorenzo Randolph had just shot Rodney Castlin. I said, okay, how did James Lorenzo Randolph get behind the counter? He said, oh, he put his hand on it and jumped it. According to this man, the two guys were there to do the robbery, shooting Rodney Castlin. That was not at all intended to occur. He gave me a great statement. I knew it was truthful, and we had it. We had it. There was no doubt in my mind that that palm print and fingerprints were the guy who demanded money, same guy who hit Carlos Torres in the back of the head with a pistol, and most importantly, pulled the trigger on Rodney Castlin. From this point forward, when I talk to James Lorenzo Randolph, it's going to be with a warrant in hand.
There is no way this could happen to someone of the character of Rodney and we not know at some point who did it.
The U.S. Marshals had located James Lorenzo Randolph. About 6:30 in the morning, they entered the house with a warrant, and the arrest was made. James was taken to the Richland County Jail by the Marshal Service.
James Lorenzo Randolph is charged with felony murder, aggravated assault, and armed robbery.
We went in to talk to James Lorenzo Randolph, and he very quickly told us he didn't have anything to say to us. He had zero reaction. None.
I was in my office and the reception came in and she said, "You have a call on the line from the Cobb County Police Department." My heart just dropped because I felt like this must be the call.
The sergeant from the Cobb County Police Department called Kelly. He said, "Kelly, I want you to know that we just arrested the guy who shot Rodney Castle." And Kelly said, "Where's John Dawes?" And he said, "He's right here," and he handed me the phone.
I just cried and I just thanked God. And I believe I asked, "Are you sure?" John said, "We're sure. We got him." That was the best call.
All I could think about was you can give me a commendation, you can throw me in the newspaper, you can give me a pay raise. I do this because I got to call Kelly. We entered into a trial. It lasted about a week after we had the jury seated.
We had assigned the case to our very experienced prosecutor. We were obviously concerned about the informant. But in the end, the individual stood up, took an oath, and laid out the entire facts of the case, including identifying Randolph as, in fact, the shooter that shot Rodney.
It was very painful to hear more details about the night. At the same time, I felt like we're finally in this moment, that we are getting answers.
With Rodney's family looking on, the jury finds James Lorenzo Randolph guilty on all counts.
The loss of my father has affected me much greater than most people think. I have no hate in my heart towards the man who killed my father and wish no harm upon the life of the man. I just hope that no person is ever given another opportunity to hurt a family like mine was hurt and still hurts after killing such an amazing man. I would do anything to tell my father one last time just how much I love him.
Neither the informant nor Randolph ever tell police anything about that third suspect. He is yet to be identified. James Lorenzo Randolph is serving 3 life sentences plus 35 years at Washington State Prison.
I miss the most hear him tell me that he loves me. He's always being thought of, even though he's not here.
He was absolutely a beautiful person. Beautiful person. I trust that I'm gonna see him again. That's what I believe.
Rodney right now would be 57 years old. The world missed out on just an abundance of love and compassion. You know, I said earlier he was an old soul, and he would always say things like, just keep on living. We're going to have our good and bad days, but we don't have to be stuck in the bad days. It's important not to be stuck in the bad days.
There is a profound and universal expectation attached to the concept of a family home. It is supposed to be a sanctuary, a fortress constructed from love and vigilance, designed to keep the chaotic and dangerous elements of the outside world firmly at bay. Within the walls of a home, parents are the ultimate protectors, the guardians of innocence, especially when it comes to their children. Society conditions us to believe that the greatest threats to our safety always originate from the outside. We lock our doors at night. We teach our children to avoid strangers, and we install security systems, all under the assumption that the perimeter is what needs defending. But there are moments in history when this fundamental assumption is violently overturned. There are tragedies that force us to confront a far more terrifying reality, one where the locked doors do not keep the danger out, but rather seal it inside. The case we are examining is a devastating testament to what happens when the very foundation of a family collapses, not from an external force, but from an internal, psychological darkness that was allowed to grow in the shadows of a seemingly ordinary life. The morning of June the 20th in the year 2001 began like countless other summer mornings in Houston, Texas. The relentless Texas heat was already beginning to rise, promising a sweltering day, but in the quiet, tree-lined suburban neighborhoods, the atmosphere was one of typical domestic tranquility. Husbands were commuting to work, children were waking up to the freedom of summer vacation, and the ordinary rhythms of suburban existence were falling into their familiar patterns. In one particular household, the Yates family residence, this morning routine was playing out with a deceptive sense of normalcy. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Rusty Yates stepped out of his house, leaving for his place of employment. He kissed his wife and his 5 young children goodbye, entirely unaware that this mundane departure would mark the absolute end of his life as he knew it. He stepped into his vehicle and drove away, leaving behind a home that was about to become the site of one of the most agonizing and widely discussed tragedies in the history of American criminal justice. Inside the house remained Andrea Yates, a 36-year-old mother of 5. She was alone with her children. The oldest was a boy of 7, the youngest a baby girl of merely 6 months. Between them were 3 other little boys, all full of the boundless energy and innocence that characterizes early childhood. For Andrea, the departure of her husband at 9 o'clock initiated a very specific, fiercely guarded countdown. She knew that her mother-in-law was scheduled to arrive at the house at 10 o'clock to help her care for the children. This meant she had exactly 1 hour. 60 minutes of total, uninterrupted isolation. In the sprawling timeline of a human life, an hour is a fleeting moment, often forgotten as soon as it passes. But in the context of this June morning, that single hour became an eternity of unimaginable horror. It was a window of opportunity, not for a stranger, not for a home invader, but for a mother who had become entirely consumed by a severe and unyielding mental illness. The silence of a house filled with 5 young children is incredibly rare. Usually, there is laughter, crying, the patter of footsteps, the sounds of toys scattering across the floor. But on this morning, the impending silence would be manufactured through deliberate, methodical action. The tragedy of Andrea Yates is not one of a sudden, chaotic explosion of violence. It is not a story of an argument gone too far or a moment of impassioned rage. It is a story of quiet, systematic, and deeply delusional execution. It is a story of a bathtub filled with water, a common household fixture transformed into an instrument of death. The water, a symbol of life and cleansing, was about to be used to extinguish the lives of 5 innocent children. In the span of that solitary hour, before the hands of the clock could reach 10, a mother would take her children, one by one, and drown them in the family bathtub. When we hear the bare facts of this event, our immediate reaction is a profound and visceral rejection. The human mind struggles to comprehend a mother capable of systematically ending the lives of her own offspring. It defies every biological imperative, every social construct, and every moral compass we possess. How does a woman look into the eyes of the children she carried, birthed, and nurtured, and hold them beneath the surface of the water until they stop breathing? The answer to that question forms the dark and complex core of this narrative. It is an answer that dragged the American legal and medical systems into a bitter, highly publicized battle over the definitions of sanity, culpability, and maternal responsibility. Immediately following the completion of this unthinkable act, there was no attempt to flee. There was no effort to conceal the bodies, to clean the scene, or to fabricate a story of an intruder. The moment the water settled and the house fell completely, permanently silent, Andrea Yates picked up the telephone. She did not call a lawyer, nor did she run out into the street in a panic. She calmly dialed 911. She requested that police and an ambulance be dispatched to her address. Following that call, she dialed the number of her husband's workplace. When Rusty Yates answered, his wife simply told him that he needed to come home immediately. She offered no elaborate explanations, no frantic pleas. The deed was done, the hour was over, and the grim machinery of the justice system was about to be set into motion. The discovery made by the responding officers who arrived at the Houston residence would traumatize them for the rest of their lives. It was a scene of such concentrated sorrow that it immediately transcended local news and became a national, and then international, focal point. But the bloodshed and the loss of life were only the beginning of the story. The aftermath of June 20th, 2001, would ignite a fierce and polarizing debate across the United States. It would force society to look deeply into the darkest corners of mental health, specifically the terrifying and often misunderstood realm of severe postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis. For years, the struggles of motherhood had been largely sanitized by societal expectations. Women were expected to handle the physical and emotional toll of childbirth with grace and resilience. The concept of a mother losing her mind, of falling into a dark abyss of hallucinations and illusions brought on by the very act of giving birth, was a taboo subject, often swept under the rug or treated with inadequate medical attention. The Andrea Yates case shattered that silence in the most violent way possible. It took the hidden pain of severe mental illness and displayed it in a courtroom for the entire world to judge. This case became a monumental turning point, a watershed moment in forensic psychiatry. It challenged the rigid boundaries of the law, specifically the ancient standards used to determine legal sanity. Could a person commit an act so fundamentally wrong, so universally abhorred, and yet be completely devoid of criminal intent? Could a mother murder her 5 children while genuinely believing, in the depths of a fractured mind, that she was performing an act of ultimate love and salvation? As we delve into the intricate details of this tragedy, we must navigate a landscape of missed warning signs, profound medical failures, and a legal system struggling to reconcile the rigidity of the law with the fluid, chaotic nature of severe mental illness. We will look closely at the years leading up to that fatal morning, tracing the tragic trajectory of a woman whose mental health slowly unraveled under the weight of repeated pregnancies and a deteriorating psychological state. We will examine the haunting clarity of her delusions, the devastating testimony presented in the courtrooms, and the profound changes this case forced upon our understanding of maternal mental health. This is not just a recounting of a crime. It is an examination of a systemic failure to protect both the mother and her children. It is a stark reminder that the human mind, when completely abandoned to the ravages of psychosis, can create a reality far more terrifying than any fiction. The story of Andrea Yates and her 5 children is a heavy, sorrowful journey. It requires us to set aside our initial judgments and look objectively at the terrifying power of disease. The events of that single hour between 9 and 10 in the morning fundamentally altered the landscape of American justice, leaving behind a legacy of mourning, a demand for better psychiatric care, and a chilling understanding that sometimes the most profound dangers do not come from the outside world, but from the untamed, untreated darkness within the mind of a protector. To truly comprehend the magnitude of the tragedy that unfolded within the Yates household, one must first look at the lives that were extinguished before they had the chance to fully begin. At the heart of this narrative are 5 young children, each at a profoundly vulnerable stage of development, each entirely dependent on the adults in their world for basic survival, comfort, and protection. The oldest of the siblings was Noah, who had just reached the age of 7. At 7, a child is just beginning to understand the broader world, developing a sense of independence, but still looking to their parents as the ultimate authority and source of safety. Following Noah was John, a 5-year-old boy, full of the curiosity and boundless energy that defines a child preparing to enter the structured environment of a school. Then came Paul, who was 3 years old, navigating the crucial developmental phase of early childhood where mobility and verbal expression are rapidly expanding. Close behind Paul was Luke, a toddler of merely 2 years, a stage characterized by an intense need for constant supervision and physical affection. Finally, there was the youngest member of the family, Mary, an infant girl who is only 6 months old. At 6 months, a baby is entirely helpless, unable to move independently or communicate needs beyond crying, relying completely on the maternal bond for every aspect of her existence. This was a household vibrating with the intense, unrelenting demands of raising 5 children under the age of 8. The physical labor alone required to feed, bathe, clothe, and monitor a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 6-month-old infant is staggering. It requires a level of stamina and mental fortitude that challenges even the most well-supported and healthy individuals. But the environment these children were growing up in was not simply demanding, it was fundamentally unstable, shadowed by a progressive and severe medical crisis that was slowly consuming their primary caregiver. The tragedy did not materialize out of a vacuum on that June morning. It was the devastating culmination of a long, documented, and agonizing descent into profound psychiatric illness, a descent that spanned several years and featured numerous, glaring warning signs that were tragically unheeded or misunderstood by those in a position to intervene. The crucial turning point in the psychological landscape of the family can be traced back to the year 1999, following the birth of the 4th child, Luke. While postpartum depression is a relatively common condition that affects many new mothers, what Andrea experienced after Luke's birth went far beyond the typical struggles of hormonal adjustment and maternal exhaustion. She plunged into a state of severe, paralyzing depression. The darkness that enveloped her mind was not merely a profound sadness, but a terrifying detachment from reality that culminated in a desperate attempt to end her own life. She deliberately ingested an overdose of prescription medication, a clear and undeniable cry for help and a stark indicator of how much pain she was enduring. This suicide attempt necessitated immediate hospitalization and intense psychiatric intervention. During this hospitalization, medical professionals were able to observe the true severity of her condition. She was not simply depressed, she was profoundly ill. The clinical diagnosis she received was major depression accompanied by psychotic features. This was a critical distinction. Psychosis represents a break from reality, a state where the brain misinterprets the world, often manifesting through hallucinations or deep-seated, unshakable delusions. It meant that the very lens through which she viewed herself, her children, and her environment was becoming warped by a severe chemical and biological imbalance. The medical staff treating her recognized the extreme danger posed by this specific combination of severe depression and psychosis, especially in a woman whose body and mind had been repeatedly taxed by rapid, successive pregnancies. Because they recognized this danger, the psychiatrists involved in her care issued a stark, unambiguous warning to the family. They explicitly advised that she should not have any more children. The medical reasoning was clear and historically sound within the field of psychiatry. Subsequent pregnancies were highly likely to trigger future and potentially far more severe episodes of postpartum psychosis. The doctors understood that the hormonal fluctuations, physical stress, and sleep deprivation associated with pregnancy and childbirth acted as potent catalysts for her specific psychological vulnerabilities. It was a professional medical directive aimed entirely at preserving her life and the safety of the children she already had. The warning was not a suggestion. It was a desperate plea to halt a biological cycle that was visibly destroying her mental architecture. Despite this grave and explicit medical warning, the family dynamic and personal convictions ultimately overrode psychiatric advice. The decision was made to continue expanding the family. This choice set the stage for the inevitable return of the illness that the doctors had predicted. In November of the year 2000, the couple welcomed their fifth child, the infant girl named Mary. With the arrival of this fifth child, the very biological trigger the psychiatrists had warned against was pulled. The fragile stability that might have been achieved through medication and therapy was instantly jeopardized by the immense physiological and psychological demands of another postpartum period, layered on top of the monumental task of caring for 4 other young boys. The situation remained precarious until a secondary, catastrophic trigger occurred just a few months later. In March of the year 2001, her father passed away. The death of a parent is a profoundly destabilizing event for anyone, but for a woman already teetering on the edge of severe postpartum psychosis, it was the catalyst for a total, systemic psychological collapse. The grief did not merely sadden her, it shattered whatever remaining defenses her mind possessed. Following the death of her father, her condition deteriorated with terrifying speed and intensity. She ceased taking her prescribed antipsychotic medication, effectively removing the only chemical barrier holding back the delusions. Without the medication, the illness aggressively reclaimed her mind. The deterioration was visible, physical, and alarming. She stopped eating, denying herself basic nourishment, and rapidly losing weight. More disturbingly, she began to engage in acts of self-mutilation, physically harming herself in response to the agonizing internal landscape she was navigating. Furthermore, she completely withdrew from her maternal responsibilities. She stopped speaking, stopped interacting, and flatly refused to care for the infant Mary or the other 4 boys. She was physically present in the house, but psychologically, she had entirely vacated the premises, replaced by a severe, unresponsive state of catatonia and psychosis. This dramatic escalation in symptoms prompted further medical evaluation, leading to a crucial and specific directive from her treating physician. Recognizing the absolute inability of the patient to function and the inherent danger her psychotic state posed to the vulnerable children, the doctor issued a strict, non-negotiable instruction to her husband and family. The order was simple but vital. She must never, under any circumstances, be left alone with the children. The physician understood that an unmedicated, psychotic individual experiencing profound delusions cannot be trusted to ensure the safety of toddlers and infants. The presence of another responsible adult was mandated not as a convenience, but as a critical safety measure, an essential safeguard against the unpredictable and often dangerous impulses generated by severe psychosis. However, this vital medical directive encountered a conflicting ideology within the household regarding how mental illness should be managed. Her husband, observing his wife's catatonic and dependent state, formed a belief that directly contradicted the psychiatrist's safety protocols. He felt that she was becoming too reliant on others, too disconnected from her role as a mother and a functioning adult. He theorized that in order for her to recover, she needed to be pushed out of her dependent state and forced to reclaim her independence and her domestic responsibilities. He believed that constant supervision was hindering her progress and that she needed to practice functioning on her own. Driven by this belief, a fatal routine was established. Despite the explicit warnings about the severe risk of postpartum psychotic episodes, despite the recent and total psychological collapse following her father's death, despite the cessation of antipsychotic medication, the self-harm, and the refusal to eat, a schedule was implemented that systematically violated the doctor's primary safety rule. The husband began to arrange his work and support schedule in a way that deliberately left his severely ill wife entirely alone and unsupervised with all 5 children for a period of time every single day. The rationale was to allow her a few hours of independence, a forced immersion back into the role she had psychologically abandoned. But leaving a woman suffering from untreated, profound psychosis alone with 5 children under the age of 8 is not an exercise in building independence. It is the removal of the final barrier preventing a catastrophe. The doctor had seen the danger and tried to construct a wall of supervision around the children. The daily routine implemented by the husband dismantled that wall, hour by hour. It created a recurring window of intense vulnerability, a specific block of time where the chaos of a fractured mind was left entirely unchecked by reality or external intervention. It was within this deliberately constructed window of forced independence, during a scheduled hour of isolation, that the warnings of the medical professionals finally materialized into an irreversible nightmare. The arrival of the morning on June 20th, 2001, brought with it the final, tragic fulfillment of a sequence that had been set in motion long before the sun began to climb over the Houston horizon. By this point, the psychological architecture of Andrea Yates had been completely eroded by the relentless tides of her untreated postpartum psychosis. The delusions that had been whispering to her for months had finally solidified into a singular, agonizing command. She was no longer just a woman suffering from a mental disorder. She had become, in her own fractured perception, a tool of divine intervention and an agent of tragic salvation. To understand the actions that took place during that fateful hour, one must step into the distorted, terrifying reality that had completely overtaken her consciousness. In her mind, the situation had reached a point of absolute, non-negotiable crisis. She perceived herself not as a mother whose children needed love and guidance, but as a person who had failed so catastrophically that she was literally possessed by evil. This was not a metaphorical feeling of failure. It was a total, consuming belief that she had become an instrument of the devil. The world, through her eyes, had become a place of irredeemable corruption, and her children were being pulled into that darkness by her own influence. She looked at her 7-year-old son Noah, the 5-year-old John, the 3-year-old Paul, the 2-year-old Luke, and the 6-month-old infant Mary, and she did not see the future. She saw only the certainty of their damnation. She believed with absolute, unwavering conviction that if these children were allowed to grow up, they would inevitably succumb to the same wickedness she felt had corrupted her own soul. They would grow up to commit sins, they would lose their innocence, and ultimately, they would be cast into the eternal fires of hell. For a mother caught in the grip of such profound psychosis, the logical, albeit horrifying, conclusion was one of mercy. In the depths of her delusions, she reasoned that the only way to save the souls of her children, to ensure their eternal place in heaven, and to spare them from the inevitable decay of the world, was to take their lives while they were still young, pure, and untainted by the influence of her own perceived evil. It was a distorted, grotesque interpretation of protection. She convinced herself that she was not destroying them, but rather rescuing them from a future of suffering. She believed that even if she were to be punished, even if she were to be executed or sent to eternal damnation herself as a result, it was a price she was willing to pay to secure the salvation of her children. This was the motive that drove her movements on that June morning, a motive fueled not by hatred or malice, but by a horrific, delusional form of love that had completely severed its connection to reality. At 9 o'clock, as her husband Rusty walked out the door, the final preparations were already in place. The silence of the house, which should have been filled with the chaotic, vibrant energy of 5 children, was instead a space of grim, heavy purpose. The bathtub, a mundane object found in every home, became the instrument through which she would execute her plan. She began by filling it with water, the temperature and the level carefully prepared. She was calm, methodical, and entirely focused on her task. There was no hesitation in her movements, no panic in her demeanor. She moved through the house, systematically calling the children into the bathroom, one by one. She started with the youngest boys. Paul, who was 3, was the first. Then came Luke, who was 2. Then John, at 5 years old. As she moved through the process, she was guided by the cold, clear logic of her delusions. She did not perceive herself as a murderer, but as a savior. With each child, the action was carried out with a strange, somber focus. After the life had been extinguished from each little body, she did not leave them in the water. She performed a morbid, ritualistic act, laying each child gently onto the bed and covering them with a blanket. It was a behavior that reflected the depth of her disconnect. She was treating the bodies of her children with a tender, almost reverent care, as if she were tucking them in for a nap, while the reality was that she had just committed an act of unspeakable violence against them. Then came the turn of the infant Mary. At only 6 months old, she was entirely defenseless, a creature of pure innocence. Andrea submerged her in the water until the light of her young life was gone. Unlike the boys, she left Mary in the bathtub. The transition from life to death for the youngest was quiet and final. Everything was proceeding according to the grim plan that her psychosis had laid out. But then, the door opened and Noah, the eldest, walked in. 7-year-old Noah represented the final hurdle. He was old enough to understand that something was profoundly wrong. When he entered the bathroom and saw his baby sister, Mary, lying in the water, the realization hit him with a visceral shock. He saw her floating, unresponsive, and the terror of the moment broke through his childhood innocence. He looked at his mother, his eyes wide with confusion and horror, and he asked her what was wrong. His question was the desperate plea of a child witnessing a reality he could not comprehend. He turned and tried to flee, to run away from the bathroom, away from the sight of his sister, and away from the nightmare that his mother had become. But Andrea was not going to be stopped. The delusion was too strong, the command too absolute. She pursued her oldest son, reaching him before he could escape the reach of the bathroom, and dragged him back inside. The struggle must have been agonizing. A mother against her own son, the protector against the protected. The strength of her conviction, fueled by the terrifying, false belief that she was saving his soul, allowed her to overcome the natural instinct to spare her child. She forced Noah back into the water, right beside the body of his infant sister, and ended his life as well. The task was finished. The house that had once echoed with the sounds of 5 siblings was now completely, utterly still. The silence that filled the rooms was a heavy, suffocating presence, a physical manifestation of the tragedy that had just occurred. Andrea stood in the bathroom, surrounded by the devastating result of her labor. At that moment, her delusion seemed to briefly recede, leaving her in a space of cold, shocking realization, yet she remained remarkably calm. She did not flee. She did not attempt to hide what she had done. She did not try to clean the bathroom or cover the tracks of her actions. She walked to the phone. Her movements were deliberate. She called 911, the emergency number. When the dispatcher answered, she gave her address and requested the presence of the police and an ambulance. Her voice was steady, lacking the frantic edge that one would expect from someone who had just committed such a horrific act. She was a woman who believed she had done what was necessary, what she had been commanded to do by forces far greater than the law of the land. After hanging up, she made the final call to her husband at his workplace. When Rusty Yates answered, he was met with the voice of his wife, telling him, with a strange, flat tone, that he needed to come home immediately. She did not explain. She did not describe the carnage that was waiting for him behind the doors of their family home. She simply instructed him to return. This moment, the call to her husband, marked the conclusion of the hour that had begun when he left for work. It was the closing of the circle. The tragedy was no longer an internal, private nightmare. It was now a public event, a crime, and a horror that would soon be discovered by the first responders who would arrive at the scene. In her interviews with investigators following her arrest, Andrea Yates would display a disturbing level of clarity regarding her motives. She did not deny the act. She did not plead ignorance of the physical nature of what she had done. She explained the details of the drownings with the same calm, detached manner she had shown on the phone. She spoke of her children not as victims of a crime, but as entities she had saved. She described her perception of herself as a bad mother, a mother who was being used by the devil to corrupt her children, and she spoke of the drowning as a necessary act of sacrifice to ensure their purity. Her narrative was consistent. It was the narrative of a woman who had been living in a completely different reality, a reality where morality was inverted, where life was something to be taken in order to preserve it, and where the ultimate act of maternal care was the total destruction of the objects of that care. The investigators were confronted with a person who was not acting out of a temporary burst of passion, but out of a deeply ingrained, unshakable belief system that had been nurtured by the untreated progression of her mental illness. It was a chilling realization that the most dangerous, lethal, and transformative threats to the sanctity of a home often do not come from the shadows of the outside world, but from the unseen, untreatable corridors of a mind that has completely lost its connection to the shared human experience. The horror of that hour was not just in the deaths themselves, but in the profound, systemic failure that had allowed this tragedy to become inevitable. The immediate aftermath of the tragedy was a visceral, chaotic scene that would forever alter the lives of those who witnessed it and the community that was forced to confront it. When the first responders arrived at the Yates residence in Houston following the frantic, cryptic calls, they were confronted not with a crime in the traditional sense of a struggle or a break-in, but with a scene of absolute, chilling stillness. The reality of what had occurred was so profoundly dissonant from the ordinary, suburban setting that it took moments for the responding officers to process the tableau before them. The investigation that followed was not a pursuit of a suspect who had fled into the night. Rather, it was a forensic examination of a tragedy that had concluded in the very heart of the family home. The detectives were tasked with peeling back the layers of a life that had, by all outward appearances, been focused on domestic stability and religious devotion, only to reveal the terminal decline of a mind lost to the ravages of severe mental illness. The investigative process began with a collection of evidence that was, by its very nature, deeply traumatic. The bathroom, which had been the site of the systematic drownings, was processed with the methodical precision required by law enforcement. Detectives documented the state of the room, the placement of the children, and the physical signs of the act. Every detail, from the wet surfaces to the items left behind, was recorded as part of an attempt to construct an objective timeline of the events that transpired between 9 and 10 o'clock that morning. The investigation was not merely about establishing guilt, as Andrea Yates had already self-reported her actions, but about establishing the state of mind of the perpetrator at the time the acts were committed. This required an exhaustive review of her medical history, her psychiatric records, and the testimonies of those who had been close to the family in the months and years leading up to the incident. As investigators delved into the background of the case, they were met with a narrative that felt both inevitable and avoidable. The medical records painted a picture of a woman who had been signaling her distress for years. The records of her previous hospitalizations, the suicide attempts, and the detailed psychiatric evaluations provided a roadmap of her decline. Detectives and prosecutors scrutinized the roles of the medical professionals who had treated her, as well as the role of her family and husband in managing her illness. They conducted extensive interviews, seeking to understand why the clear warnings issued by psychiatrists, specifically the warning that she should not have any more children and the warning that she must never be left alone with the children, had been disregarded. The focus of the investigation moved beyond the physical act of the drownings to the systemic failure of the support structure surrounding the mother. The legal strategy for the defense was built entirely upon the foundation of her documented mental health history. The legal team sought to demonstrate that Andrea Yates was, at the time of the murders, completely detached from reality. They gathered testimony from experts who could attest to the severity of her postpartum psychosis, explaining to investigators and later to the court how such a condition manifests in the mind of the sufferer. They argued that her delusions were not fleeting thoughts but were an all-encompassing, defining reality that rendered her incapable of understanding the wrongfulness of her actions. This was a critical distinction for the investigation. They were building a case that argued she did not possess the mens rea, or the guilty mind, required to commit murder under the legal definition because her mind was not in control of its own perceptions. The prosecution, meanwhile, focused on the evidence of her planning and the methodical nature of the execution. They pointed to the fact that she waited until her husband left for work to initiate the sequence, that she followed a specific, systematic order in drowning the children, and that she possessed the presence of mind to call for help afterward. This, they argued, was evidence of a conscious, deliberate choice. They sought to dismantle the defense's argument of insanity by highlighting what they perceived as calculated, purposeful actions. The investigative report was a complex tapestry of conflicting perspectives: the clinical view of a woman suffering from a total psychological break versus the legal view of a woman who understood the implications of her conduct and acted with a clear, albeit horrific, intent. As the investigation deepened, the focus shifted to the role of the husband, Rusty Yates. Detectives questioned him about the decisions that had been made in the household, specifically regarding the supervision of his wife and the cessation of her medication. His testimony was a point of significant scrutiny. Investigators were tasked with understanding whether his actions were driven by a genuine belief in his wife's recovery or by a dangerous misunderstanding of the nature of her mental illness. The investigation into the household routine revealed a critical failure in risk management. By creating a structure that left her alone with the children, the safeguards recommended by the doctors were effectively dismantled. The detectives were essentially conducting a post-mortem of a tragedy, trying to determine exactly where the lines of responsibility were drawn. The role of the experts in the investigation was paramount. Forensic psychiatrists were brought in to conduct rigorous evaluations of Andrea. These evaluations were grueling, involving hours of interviews designed to probe the depths of her delusions and the extent of her cognitive impairment. The investigators watched as the clinical picture of the defendant became increasingly complex. She spoke of her children as if they were present, her expressions and tone remaining consistent with her delusional beliefs. This consistency was a significant piece of evidence that the defense used to bolster their claim of insanity. To the investigators, the unwavering nature of her delusions was the most compelling evidence that her mind was indeed broken, rather than simply malingering or attempting to escape accountability. A significant hurdle in the investigation was the public and media pressure that surrounded the case. The nature of the crime, a mother killing her own children, was so incendiary that it captured the attention of the entire nation. Investigators were working under the intense glare of the media, which sought to simplify a deeply complex case into a narrative of good versus evil. The detectives had to navigate this pressure, ensuring that the investigation remained focused on the facts and the psychiatric evidence rather than the public outcry. They had to maintain the integrity of the evidence in a climate that was emotionally charged and biased against the defendant. As the pretrial phase progressed, the investigation also uncovered the failures in the broader medical system. It became clear that the psychiatric care Andrea received had been, in many ways, disjointed and insufficient. The lack of continuity in her treatment, the miscommunication between various doctors, and the failure of the system to mandate follow-up care for a patient with such a high risk of relapse were all identified as factors. The investigation into these systemic failures was just as important as the investigation into the crime itself, as it revealed the vulnerabilities in how society treats and manages severe mental illness in the home. The culmination of the investigative phase was the preparation for the trial. This involved gathering, organizing, and synthesizing thousands of pages of medical records, police reports, interview transcripts, and expert testimonies. The goal was to present a coherent narrative that would allow the court to understand the reality of the situation without losing sight of the horrific nature of the consequences. The investigators were not just trying to solve a mystery, they were trying to explain a phenomenon. They were documenting the slow, agonizing, and preventable unraveling of a family, providing the court with the necessary context to determine the culpability of a woman who had, in every sense of the word, lost her mind to the darkest corners of human biology. The final report was a somber document, representing months of dedicated, high-pressure work. It detailed the chronology of the events, the medical background, the systemic failures, and the specific, tragic actions taken by Andrea Yates. It provided the framework for the legal battle that would define her life and shape the future of forensic psychiatry. As the investigation concluded, the focus shifted from the gathering of facts to the interpretation of those facts in a court of law. The detectives and experts had done their job. They had laid bare the inner workings of a tragedy that had once been hidden behind the doors of a suburban home, forcing the public and the legal system to confront the terrifying reality of what happens when mental illness goes untreated. The evidence was clear, the tragedy was absolute, and the stage was set for a trial that would become an enduring, painful, and critical piece of American jurisprudence. The investigation had moved past the initial horror, successfully transitioning into a rigorous and difficult process of uncovering the truth behind a mother's catastrophic descent. The trial phase of the Andrea Yates case would become one of the most polarizing and scrutinized legal proceedings in American history, serving as a visceral battlefield where the rigidity of the law collided with the fluid, often unfathomable nature of human psychosis. The first trial, which took place in 2002, functioned as a grim theater of judgment. The prosecution's narrative was anchored in the Manhattan Rule, a long-standing legal standard that posits a defendant can only be declared not guilty by reason of insanity if they were incapable of distinguishing right from wrong at the moment of the crime. To the prosecution, the case was a matter of simple, horrific logic. Andrea Yates knew what she was doing, she knew it was illegal, and she knew the consequences. They pointed to the meticulous nature of the drownings, the waiting for her husband to leave, and the subsequent, composed phone calls as irrefutable evidence of a functioning, if malevolent, mind. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with the weight of the 5 small lives lost. The prosecution's strategy was to strip away the clinical, psychiatric complexities and present the jury with the stark, brutal reality of the act itself. They presented witnesses who detailed the events of that June morning, ensuring that the jury was confronted with the physical evidence of the drownings. A key figure for the prosecution was Dr. Park Dietz, a high-profile forensic psychiatrist who offered testimony that would later become the central pivot point for the entire legal saga. Dr. Dietz asserted that Andrea Yates was fully aware of the moral and legal weight of her actions. He went further, making a startling claim during his testimony. He alleged that Andrea had recently watched an episode of the television show Law and Order that featured a plotline involving a mother drowning her children, and that this broadcast had served as a blueprint for her own actions. This testimony was a hammer blow to the defense. It painted Andrea not as a woman lost in a delusional fog, but as a calculated individual who had sought out and adopted a blueprint for murder. The jury, faced with the overwhelming horror of the crime and the professional assertion that the defendant knew exactly what she was doing, returned a guilty verdict. Andrea Yates was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after serving 40 years. For the prosecution and a significant portion of the public, the verdict felt like a firm, necessary stand against the murder of children, upholding the idea that even in the face of profound mental suffering, individuals must be held accountable for their actions under the law. However, the conclusion of the first trial was not the end of the story. In the years that followed, the foundation of the guilty verdict began to crack. During the appeals process, a startling discovery was made. The testimony provided by Dr. Park Dietz, which had been so damaging to the defense and so influential to the jury, was fundamentally flawed. It was revealed that the episode of Law and Order he described as the inspiration for the crime did not actually exist. The claim that Andrea had consumed such media was a total fabrication. This revelation was an absolute catastrophe for the integrity of the original trial. The conviction had been secured, in part, on the back of false evidence presented by a witness who was supposed to be an objective expert. In 2005, the Texas Court of Appeals took the rare and dramatic step of overturning the conviction, ruling that the false testimony had fundamentally compromised the fairness of the judicial process. The overturning of the verdict meant that the entire ordeal would have to be relived. A second trial was scheduled for 2006, and it would unfold in a radically different climate. The legal teams, the prosecution, and the defense were now operating with the knowledge that the previous conviction had been built on a lie. This time, the proceedings were far more focused on the medical and psychiatric reality of Andrea's condition. The defense, armed with a deeper and more accurate understanding of her mental state, presented a robust, exhaustive case for insanity. They brought in a parade of psychiatric experts who dissected the years of her medical history, the documented episodes of psychosis, the suicide attempts, and the explicit warnings from her previous physicians. The courtroom became a space of clinical examination. The defense successfully argued that the prosecution's reliance on the idea of a calculated crime ignored the absolute totality of her delusions. They presented the perspective that, for Andrea, the acts were not a defiance of the law but a misguided, delusional attempt to adhere to a higher, divine calling, to save her children from the corruption she perceived in herself. They made the case that she was not distinguishing right from wrong because, in the warped reality of her psychosis, she believed she was doing the only right thing possible. The jury, this time, was asked to look beyond the horrific nature of the deed and consider the state of the mind that performed it. They were presented with a woman who had been clearly and consistently diagnosed as severely mentally ill, whose illness had been left untreated and exacerbated by systemic failures in her medical care and domestic environment. The deliberations were intense. The members of the jury were forced to weigh the horrific reality of the outcome, 5 children dead, against the medical evidence that the mother was, at the time, operating under a total break from reality. The second trial concluded with a verdict that was both expected by those familiar with the psychiatric details and shocking to those who still saw only the crime. The jury declared Andrea Yates not guilty by reason of insanity. The verdict was a landmark, not because it diminished the tragedy of the children's deaths, but because it forced the legal system to accept that, in rare and extreme cases, a human mind can become so fractured by illness that the legal definitions of intent and moral culpability no longer apply. The decision triggered a new wave of public debate. Some felt the verdict was a failure of justice, a loophole that allowed a murderer to escape a life sentence. Others saw it as a necessary and humanitarian conclusion, acknowledging that sentencing a woman who had been clearly suffering from an unmanaged, severe psychiatric crisis to a standard prison sentence was not justice, but merely another iteration of a systemic failure. The not guilty by reason of insanity verdict meant that Andrea would not be sent to prison, but instead, she would be committed to a state psychiatric hospital for mandatory treatment. This move from the criminal justice system to the psychiatric system marked a fundamental change in how the case was viewed. She was placed in the Kerrville State Hospital in Texas. The court-ordered commitment was indefinite, subject to ongoing, rigorous evaluations by medical professionals. The purpose of this detention was not punishment, but the stabilization of her mental health and the monitoring of her condition to ensure that she would never again pose a risk to herself or others. The transition from a convicted murderer to a patient in an involuntary psychiatric facility was a profound shift in her status, and it reflected the court's ultimate determination that her crime was the product of a disease that required treatment rather than incarceration. The aftermath of this trial brought a sense of closure to the legal proceedings, but it left a lingering shadow of tragedy that would never truly dissipate. The courtroom arguments, the expert testimonies, and the final verdict all served as a painful, public dissection of a family's life. The trial underscored the absolute difficulty of navigating the intersection of law and psychiatry. It demonstrated that when a person's mind is completely consumed by a disease as potent as postpartum psychosis, the traditional mechanisms of criminal law, with their focus on binary concepts of guilt and innocence, right and wrong, often struggle to capture the complex, tragic truth of the situation. The judicial process had finally reached a conclusion, but it was a conclusion that felt more like a recognition of a catastrophic failure than a resolution of a crime. The state hospital became the final, quiet residence for the woman who had once been the center of a vibrant, albeit struggling, household. She had been removed from the outside world, placed in an environment where her mental state would be the primary and only concern of those around her, effectively ending the public story of Andrea Yates and the life she had destroyed, but leaving behind an enduring, haunting, and cautionary tale that would be analyzed and debated in law schools and psychiatric clinics for decades to come. The process had been exhaustive. The costs, both human and financial, were immense, and the lessons extracted from the rubble of this tragedy were hard-won and deeply, profoundly sorrowful. The second trial did not erase the loss of the 5 children. It merely validated the existence of a darkness so total that it had rendered a mother unrecognizable to her family and, in the end, even to herself. The legacy of the Andrea Yates case is etched into the very foundations of American jurisprudence and mental health policy, standing as a somber, permanent reminder of the catastrophic consequences that can arise when the boundaries between clinical pathology and criminal intent are left dangerously undefined. In the years that have followed, the story of what transpired in that Houston home has transcended the sensational headlines that originally defined it, evolving into an essential case study for legal scholars, forensic psychiatrists, and social workers alike. It forced a national reckoning with the reality of postpartum psychosis, a condition that, while medically documented, had been largely relegated to the shadows of private domestic life. The tragedy served to break the silence surrounding maternal mental health, compelling a more rigorous examination of the profound physiological and psychological transformations that occur during and after pregnancy. The impact on medical practice has been profound. In the aftermath of the trial, the understanding of perinatal mental health shifted from a general awareness of post-birth melancholy to a specialized, acute recognition of the risk factors for psychotic breaks. Many states and medical institutions across the United States implemented mandatory screening programs, ensuring that women navigating the high-risk periods of pregnancy and postpartum recovery are regularly assessed for psychiatric symptoms. This systemic change was a direct response to the glaring failures exposed by the Yates tragedy, where the warnings of medical professionals were ignored or undervalued until it was far too late. The medical community began to champion a more integrated approach, recognizing that the health of the mother is inextricably linked to the safety and well-being of the infant, and that untreated psychosis is a medical emergency that requires the same level of urgency as any physical crisis. Legally, the case serves as one of the most significant touchstones for the interpretation of the insanity defense in the 21st century. It highlighted the immense difficulty that courts face when attempting to apply 19th-century legal standards, such as the Manhattan Rule, to the complex realities of modern psychiatry. The case demonstrated that a defendant's outward appearance of composure or their ability to perform sequential tasks does not necessarily indicate a lack of severe, debilitating mental illness. The legal precedent set by her eventual acquittal on the grounds of insanity provided a vital, albeit controversial, framework for future cases involving defendants suffering from profound psychiatric disorders. It forced the judiciary to grapple with the nuance of wrongfulness, acknowledging that a person acting under the iron grip of a psychotic delusion may genuinely lack the cognitive capacity to understand that their actions are prohibited by law or by the fundamental moral consensus of society. As for the personal trajectory of Andrea Yates, her life since the second trial has been marked by a quiet, self-imposed isolation within the walls of the Kerrville State Hospital. Her decision to remain in treatment, consistently declining the opportunity to petition for release, serves as a final, haunting dimension to this narrative. She has remained within the psychiatric system, submitting to continuous observation and treatment, effectively choosing to live out her years in a state of clinical confinement. This choice is perceived by many observers as a form of lifelong penance, a recognition of the irreversible damage she caused, and a testament to the fact that her mental illness, while managed, is a reality she must live with every day. The fact that she does not seek her freedom speaks to the gravity of the psychological weight she carries. Even if she were to be deemed fit for reintegration into society, the reality of what she did to her 5 children remains an insurmountable barrier to any conventional concept of normalcy. The public perception of the case has also undergone a gradual transformation. Initially, the media coverage and the public reaction were defined by shock, condemnation, and a desire to see retribution. Over time, however, as the clinical details of her untreated postpartum psychosis became better understood, the narrative began to shift toward one of sympathy for the lost children and a growing, tragic understanding of the mother's role as both a perpetrator and a victim of a system that failed to intervene in time. This is not to diminish the horror of the loss. 5 young lives were extinguished in the most intimate of ways, but it reflects a more mature engagement with the complexities of human suffering. The society that was once thirsty for a simple guilty verdict eventually came to acknowledge that the tragedy was not just a crime, but a culmination of systemic medical and familial neglect that allowed a severe, detectable, and treatable illness to evolve into a horrific, irreversible event. Beyond the courtroom and the hospital, the Yates tragedy continues to serve as an enduring, cautionary tale in the fields of sociology and public health. It highlights the dangers of societal expectations that place immense, often unrealistic, pressure on mothers to be the sole providers of care and stability. It exposes the risks of cultural stigmas that prevent families from openly discussing mental health struggles, often leading to the concealment of symptoms until they reach a breaking point. The narrative of her life and the destruction of her family has been studied in academic settings to help identify the warning signs of caregiver collapse, emphasizing the need for comprehensive support networks that extend beyond the nuclear family unit. The tragic loss of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary became a catalyst for advocacy, driving home the point that the preservation of children's lives is a collective responsibility that requires proactive, informed, and continuous intervention from the broader community and healthcare system. The perhaps most lingering aspect of this tragedy is the silence that now surrounds the home where it happened, and the memory of the 5 children who never had the chance to grow up. The case remains a standard reference point whenever discussions arise regarding the limits of criminal responsibility and the imperative of psychiatric care. It is a reminder that the most profound threats to the domestic sphere are not always external, but can be internal, silent, and insidious. The tragedy of June 20th, 2001, is a heavy, frozen moment in time that continues to teach us about the fragility of the human mind and the catastrophic potential of untreated illness. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten, as it forces us to confront the uncomfortable realities of our own institutions and the ways in which we might prevent such a total collapse from ever happening again. Ultimately, reflecting on the Andrea Yates case requires a delicate balance of acknowledging the enormity of the loss while examining the complex, psychiatric realities that preceded it. The children who died were the innocent victims of a medical and systemic disaster, and their memories are kept alive in the continued push for better mental health awareness and reform. The legal system's journey from a conviction based on false evidence to an acquittal based on medical reality represents a long, arduous process of seeking a form of truth that goes beyond simple labels of good and evil. The tragedy serves as a solemn marker of how far the understanding of maternal mental health has come and how much work remains to be done to ensure that no other family has to navigate such a profound, preventable catastrophe. The story does not have a happy ending. It does not provide any sense of satisfaction or comfort. It is and will remain a deeply unsettling, sorrowful chapter in the history of American life. The lessons of this case are etched into the policies of our hospitals and the precedents of our courts, but they are also etched into the public consciousness as a warning. We are reminded that the stability of our most cherished institutions depends on the health, safety, and support of every individual within them. As we continue to study and analyze the tragic path that Andrea Yates traveled, we are not looking for excuses. We are looking for the tools to recognize the signs of distress before they escalate into violence, to provide support before the mental health of a parent unravels, and to protect the lives of children from the invisible, devastating, and potentially lethal power of severe, untreated psychological disease. The legacy of this case is the enduring, urgent call for a society that values, prioritizes, and protects the sanctity of mental health as a fundamental pillar of human safety and dignity, ensuring that the shadows that once claimed the Yates household do not again find purchase in the lives of other families. The tragedy of the 5 children remains, for all of us, an unforgettable, somber, and vital lesson that we are still striving to learn. The conclusion of the Andrea Yates saga is not found in a final courtroom verdict or a medical discharge summary, but in the enduring, quiet aftermath that continues to shape our cultural and ethical understanding of human fragility. The weight of what occurred on that summer morning in Houston has never truly lifted. Instead, it has settled into the bedrock of American history, serving as a permanent, chilling reference point for the intersection of mental illness and the justice system. When we look back at the years since the trial, We see that the story of the Yates family is less a narrative of a singular crime and more a profound exploration of the limits of human empathy and the complexities of moral culpability. The lives of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary remain the silent center of this discourse, their innocence a sharp, painful contrast to the darkness that eventually claimed them. Their memory has become a catalyst for a sustained, necessary, and often painful dialogue about the responsibilities of the state, the medical community, and the individuals tasked with the stewardship of children. The transformation of the public discourse surrounding this case is perhaps its most significant, if quiet, legacy. In the years immediately following the tragedy, the reaction was largely defined by a visceral, protective rage. It was a reaction that demanded clear answers and firm retribution, driven by a deep-seated need to categorize the act in a way that felt safe and predictable. However, as the medical, forensic, and social details became more widely understood, the narrative began to shift. The public began to grapple with the discomfort of recognizing that the line between a villain and a victim of disease is not always bright or easy to discern. This shift was not an exoneration of the act itself, but a realization that the tragedy was symptomatic of a much broader, systemic failure. It forced society to consider how many other women were suffering in the quiet, isolated corners of their homes, struggling with the invisible, ravaging symptoms of postpartum psychosis, without the support or intervention they so desperately needed. This broader understanding has led to a fundamental restructuring of how we approach maternal mental health. The medical community now operates under a more integrated and proactive model of care, recognizing that the health of a mother is an essential component of the health of her children. The policies that emerged from the lessons of the Yates case have become standard in many states, emphasizing that the psychiatric well-being of a new parent is not a luxury or a secondary concern, but a matter of fundamental safety. The protocols for monitoring mothers with histories of mental illness have become more robust, ensuring that the warning signs, those same indicators that were missed or ignored in the Yates household, are now treated with the gravity they deserve. The medical field has, in essence, learned from the catastrophic cost of its own past oversights, creating a framework of vigilance designed to prevent the recurrence of such a total collapse of support. The legal system, too, has been indelibly marked by the proceedings of the two trials. The shift from a binary, punitive approach to one that acknowledges the role of severe mental impairment has been a slow and arduous process, but it has led to a more nuanced application of the law. The legal recognition that a person can be so deeply disconnected from reality that they are incapable of understanding the wrongfulness of their actions has become a more refined, if still contentious, area of jurisprudence. The Yates case stands as a landmark in this regard, reminding legal scholars and practitioners alike that the law must have the capacity to recognize when it is dealing with a brain in the throes of a biological storm rather than a mind functioning with clear, criminal intent. It is a lesson in the necessity of compassion within the judicial process, even in the face of the most harrowing and irreparable outcomes. However, the legacy of the case is not solely found in policy shifts or legal precedents. It is found in the deeply personal, private, and ongoing aftermath experienced by those whose lives were shattered. For the surviving family members and those closest to the tragedy, there is no closure, only a long, ongoing process of living with the memory of what was lost. The tragedy is a permanent, indelible scar, a reminder of the fragility of the structures we take for granted. It has become a story that is passed down, analyzed, and revisited, each retelling adding a new layer of sorrow and insight. The intensity of the public fascination with the case, while often difficult for those involved, has also served to ensure that the lives of the 5 children are not reduced to mere statistics or footnotes in a legal textbook. They are remembered as children, each with their own potential, their own innocence, and their own place in the world that was tragically and prematurely removed from them. In the academic and professional realms, the case continues to be a staple of curricula, providing a case study in the complexities of care, the dangers of diagnostic labels, and the profound ethical challenges that arise when medicine and law collide. It has fostered a deeper, more empathetic training for doctors and lawyers who are taught to look beyond the surface of a case, to understand the history, the the context, and the fundamental human factors that influence the path of a person's mental health. This pedagogical focus ensures that the lessons of the past are translated into a more thoughtful, better-equipped generation of professionals who are prepared to handle the most difficult challenges at the intersection of psychiatry and public service. It is a way of ensuring that the horror of the past becomes a foundation for a more humane and effective future. The story of Andrea Yates and her children serves as an enduring reminder that the most profound and devastating tragedies are often the most complex and difficult to understand. It teaches us that the preservation of human life is a multifaceted endeavor, requiring the vigilance of families, the expertise of medical professionals, and the wisdom of the legal system working in concert. It warns us against the dangers of silence, the risks of isolation, and the catastrophic outcomes of leaving mental illness untreated. It is a story that requires us to be more attentive to those around us, to recognize the signs of distress, and to offer support before the weight of life becomes too much for the mind to bear. It is a story that asks us to recognize the humanity in even the most fractured of individuals, while never losing sight of the horrific toll their actions have taken on the innocent. As we continue to reflect on the events of June 20th, 2001, we are reminded that some questions have no easy answers, and some tragedies leave an emptiness that can never be filled. The case of Andrea Yates remains an open wound in the collective memory, a testament to the immense, devastating power of mental illness and the fragility of the suburban dream. It is a narrative that forces us to reconcile with the limits of our own knowledge and our own capacity to care for one another. It is a story that refuses to let us look away, compelling us to confront the uncomfortable, painful, and essential truths about the human condition. In this way, the story lives on, not just as a historical event, but as an ongoing, living, and vital part of our efforts to create a safer, more compassionate world. Ultimately, the most important work resulting from this tragedy is the continued, collective effort to ensure that no other mother or child has to face the kind of darkness that defined the Yates family. It is a commitment to a society where mental health care is accessible, proactive, and compassionate, and where the welfare of families is held as a sacred, fundamental responsibility. It is a commitment to seeing the person behind the diagnosis, the child behind the loss, and the humanity that survives even the most catastrophic of circumstances. The legacy of this case is the persistent, quiet demand for better care, better understanding, and a better, more supportive way of living together. It is a legacy of sorrow, but also one of profound, necessary change, ensuring that from the depths of a devastating past, we can continue to build toward a future where such tragedies are understood, prevented, and, ultimately, held in the light of our shared commitment to one another. The 5 children are the heart of this legacy, and the work done in their memory is the only meaningful response to a tragedy that has left us all, in some small but indelible way, changed forever. The final reflection on the Yates tragedy must inevitably turn to the question of what remains after the dust of legal contention and medical debate has finally settled. We are left with the inescapable reality of 5 lives: Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary, whose individual futures were silenced in a single, catastrophic mourning. The vacuum created by their absence is not merely a personal one for their immediate family, but a broader, societal one. Their deaths forced a confrontation with a truth that society often prefers to ignore, that the sanctity of the home, while essential, can also serve as an impenetrable barrier that hides the most desperate, treatable crises from the view of those who might offer help. The memory of these children is now inextricably bound to a movement that demands, with increasing urgency, that we as a society stop viewing mental health as a private, optional concern and start treating it with the same priority as physical trauma. The evolution of our response to this case is a testament to our ongoing journey toward greater empathy and institutional competence. In the early days, the focus was understandably narrow, locked in a binary struggle of accountability. Today, the perspective has expanded into a more sophisticated understanding of systemic care. We have learned that the health of a primary caregiver is the single most important environmental factor for the development and survival of a child. By failing to support Andrea Yates, The institutions around her, the medical providers, the social support structures, and the personal support network failed the children who relied on her. This realization has been the driving force behind the reforms in perinatal health that have taken root across the country. It is a slow, difficult path toward progress, but it is one that is built on the hard-won lessons of a tragedy that can never be undone. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of this ongoing reflection is acknowledging the inherent uncertainty that will always surround the case. Even with the clarity provided by clinical diagnostics, there is a lingering, haunting question about whether different choices might have led to a different outcome. If the medical directives had been followed with unwavering strictness, if the support system had been more cohesive, if the stigma surrounding her symptoms had been effectively removed, would the tragic sequence have been broken? These questions do not have answers, but they serve as a powerful catalyst for the vigilance that is now required in modern psychiatric practice. They serve as a reminder that every moment of intervention, every moment of clear communication, and every moment of empathy can be the difference between a crisis that is managed and a tragedy that is catastrophic. The institution of the state hospital where Andrea Yates has spent the decades since her acquittal is, in its own way, a monument to the complexity of her existence. It is a place where the focus is entirely on the management of a condition that took everything from her. Her presence there, as a patient who has chosen to remain under care, provides a stark contrast to the narratives of vengeance that often dominate true crime. It represents a different kind of ending, one that is defined by the recognition of chronic, life-altering illness rather than the finality of criminal punishment. It is a quiet, shadowed space that forces us to reconcile with the fact that even when the legal system is satisfied, the human cost of such a catastrophe remains an ongoing, living reality. Looking ahead, the legacy of the Yates case will continue to be a primary reference point for future generations of mental health professionals and legal scholars. It will be taught as a reminder that the brain is a biological organ, susceptible to illnesses that can utterly transform a person's perception of reality, duty, and love. The case will continue to challenge the way we train our clinicians to recognize the signs of postpartum psychosis, ensuring that they are equipped to act long before a patient reaches the point of no return. It will also remain a standard for how we navigate the difficult terrain of the insanity defense, providing a lens through which we can observe the collision of law and medicine with more clarity and less reflexive judgment. The goal is not to justify the act, but to understand it with enough depth that we can prevent its precursors from ever again culminating in such a devastating loss. We must also consider the role of the community in this narrative. The Yates tragedy was not just a medical failure, it was a communal one. It highlights the importance of the networks that surround families, particularly those in the vulnerable stages of infancy and early childhood. The need for neighbors, friends, and extended family to be aware of the signs of severe psychological distress is a vital component of the societal safety net. When we cultivate a culture that prioritizes open communication, destigmatizes the need for help, and promotes the availability of resources, we create a stronger, more resilient foundation for every family. The Yates tragedy serves as a constant, quiet call to action, reminding us that we are all, in a sense, the guardians of the homes in our communities, and that our collective attention can be the difference between a family that is supported and a family that is left to navigate the darkness alone. As we reach the conclusion of this exploration, we are left with a profound sense of humility. We are forced to admit that there are aspects of the human experience, the depths of mental illness, the complexities of maternal love, and the terrifying speed of systemic failure that continue to defy our ability to fully capture or control. We can document the facts, analyze the evidence, and learn from the failures, but we are always left with the reality of the loss. The memory of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary remains our most significant compass in this work. They represent the ultimate stakes of our commitment to mental health care and the profound, irreplaceable value of every life. Their short lives have become the reason for our ongoing effort to do better, to be more attentive, and to strive for a world where the shadows of illness are met with the light of effective, timely, and unwavering support. The final, lasting image of this case is not of the crime scene or the courtroom, but of the ongoing, quiet, and necessary work that happens every day in hospitals, in legal offices, and in the hearts of those who continue to advocate for change. The story of Andrea Yates is a chapter in the history of our society that will never be closed. It is a story that requires constant re-examination, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a deep-seated humanitarian obligation. It is a story that forces us to look in the mirror and ask what kind of society we are, what we owe to the most vulnerable among us, and how we can ensure that the safety of our children is never again compromised by our failure to understand, to intervene, and to truly care. In this, we find the only possible path forward. We transform the sorrow of the past into the action of the present. We take the lessons of this devastating history and apply them to the way we live, the way we work, and the way we support one another. We recognize that the fight for better mental health is a fight for the very fabric of our society. The Yates case has left an indelible mark on our culture, a mark that serves as a sentinel, a warning, and a guide. It ensures that the memory of the lost is tethered to the growth of the living, and that the promise of a safer, more empathetic future is one that we are all, collectively, working to fulfill. This is the ultimate resolution of the tragedy, not a restoration of what was lost, but a dedication to ensuring that the lessons of that loss are never squandered, and that the future is brighter, more vigilant, and more compassionate because of the profound, sorrowful light shed by this devastating event. The work continues, the memory remains, and the resolve to do better is, in the end, the only tribute that remains for the 5 children whose lives were meant for so much more. This is the story, this is the history, and this is the enduring, imperative call for all of us to ensure that the tragedy of the Yates family remains the final, absolute boundary of our collective failure. As we move past the immediate clinical and legal implications of the Andrea Yates case, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a much broader, philosophical inquiry into the nature of human responsibility and the limits of the social contract. The tragedy of June 20th, 2001, was not merely a failure of a specific household or a specific medical system. It was a profound, chilling display of how fragile the structures of our daily existence truly are when they are left to rest on a foundation of untreated, misunderstood disease. The story of what happened within those 4 walls in Houston continues to reverberate through our collective conscience, serving as a reminder that the safety of our most vulnerable, our children, is a responsibility that cannot be outsourced to the individual alone. It is a burden that the entire community, the entire healthcare infrastructure, and the entire legal framework must share, and the failure of any one of these pillars can lead to the kind of irreversible ruin that we have examined throughout this narrative. The philosophical weight of this case lies in our struggle to reconcile the horror of the outcome with the documented reality of the perpetrator's fractured mind. We are forced to look at Andrea Yates and see both a mother who committed an act of unspeakable violence and a human being whose biology had betrayed her in the most absolute, terrifying way possible. This duality is the source of our enduring discomfort. It prevents us from dismissing her as a simple monster, yet it forbids us from excusing her actions as if they were a tragic accident. It forces us to sit in the tension of that space, acknowledging that while justice may have been served through the psychiatric commitment, the moral debt of the tragedy remains, a silent, heavy presence that informs our every subsequent discussion about mental health and accountability. This discomfort, however, is not a negative trait. It is a necessary part of our moral evolution. It is precisely through this struggle to understand the incomprehensible that we grow as a society. By refusing to look away from the darkness, by forcing ourselves to analyze the specific, granular details of her decline, we have gained a much clearer view of the terrain that leads to such catastrophes. We have moved from a position of reflexive, emotional judgment to one of analytical, systemic scrutiny. We have learned to look for the patterns, the indicators, and the subtle shifts in behavior that precede a total collapse. We have developed a language for talking about postpartum psychosis that is both clinical and compassionate, ensuring that the next time a mother presents with these signs, she is met not with fear or isolation, but with immediate, targeted, and life-saving intervention. The legacy of the Yates children, Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary, is thus transformed from a tragedy into a mandate for systemic change. Every time a new policy is drafted to improve perinatal mental health care, every time a courtroom handles a case involving psychiatric distress with a deeper, more informed sensitivity, their names are, in a very real sense, being honored. Their short lives have become a foundation upon which we are building a more secure future for others. This is the only way that the sheer, overwhelming weight of their loss can be carried forward. It must be channeled into a persistent, unwavering commitment to ensuring that the systemic failures that claim them are systematically dismantled and replaced by a culture of safety, awareness, and proactive care. We must also consider the role of memory in this ongoing process. The tragedy of the Yates household is a story that refuses to be relegated to the past. It is a story that is constantly being retold, analyzed, and integrated into our understanding of the human condition. This act of remembering is vital. It keeps the horror alive as a warning, but it also keeps the urgency of our reform efforts alive as a motivation. We remember the children not just to mourn them, but to remind ourselves of what is at stake. When we lose sight of the stakes, when we allow ourselves to become complacent, to assume that the support systems are enough, to overlook the subtle signs of decline, we increase the risk of another such failure. The story of these 5 children must remain a constant, quiet presence in our discourse, a reminder of the fragility of the domestic sphere and the vital necessity of the work we do to protect it. Looking toward the future, the work that remains is largely centered on the democratization of mental health care. We know now that the risk of postpartum psychosis does not discriminate. It is a biological vulnerability that can affect any mother, regardless of her background, her faith, or her preparation for motherhood. The lessons of the Yates case teach us that we must be prepared to provide care that is as pervasive and accessible as the vulnerability itself. We must work toward a society where the stigma of reaching out for help is completely eradicated, where the postpartum period is treated as a high-risk time that deserves its own dedicated infrastructure of support, and where no mother is ever left to face the terrifying, isolating symptoms of a break from reality without a strong, visible, and effective network of care around her. The philosophical shift that we are witnessing is a move toward a more integrated vision of human health. We are beginning to see that the divide between the body and the mind is an artificial one, and that the health of the brain is the health of the person. When a mother is in the throes of a psychotic break, it is not merely a psychological issue. It is a systemic, biological, and existential crisis that demands the full weight of our collective, clinical, and institutional resources. This shift in perspective is the ultimate, long-term impact of the Yates tragedy. It has accelerated our arrival at a more mature, more compassionate, and more realistic understanding of what it means to be human in the face of disease. As we conclude this deep, sorrowful exploration of the Andrea Yates case, we are left with a final sense of responsibility. We have examined the tragedy from every angle: the personal, the clinical, the legal, and the societal. We have seen how the threads of failure were woven together, step by agonizing step, until the fabric of the family home was destroyed. We have witnessed the immense, unrecoverable cost of that destruction. And now, we are left with the burden of that knowledge. We cannot unknow what we have learned. We cannot unsee the systemic failures that were laid bare. We are, therefore, obligated to act. We are obligated to be the keepers of the safety that was once so tragically lacking. We are obligated to keep the memory of the 5 lost children at the forefront of our work, ensuring that their lives, cut so short, continue to inform, to guide, and to protect. The story of the Yates family is the final, absolute boundary of our collective failure, and it is our collective duty to ensure that we never cross that threshold again. This requires a persistent, quiet, and everyday commitment. It requires us to listen when a mother says she is struggling, to intervene when we see the signs of collapse, to advocate for policies that prioritize the well-being of families, and to never, under any circumstances, assume that we are immune to the darkness that can take root in the most familiar of places. The resolution of this tragedy is not something that happens once. It is something that happens constantly, in every interaction, in every policy decision, and in every effort to provide the support that is so often needed but so frequently forgotten. The 5 children remain the heart of our mission, the silent, guiding force behind the work of mental health reform. Their story is a heavy one, a dark one, and an essential one. It is the story that reminds us of the true meaning of the word protector. We are all, in our own way, the protectors of the children in our communities. We are the ones who must recognize the warning signs, provide the safety net, and ensure that the sanctity of the home is a real, tangible, and effective reality. By doing so, we ensure that the light of the 5 lives lost in Houston does not go out, but continues to burn, providing the warmth and the warning that we need to build a future where every family is supported, every mother is cared for, and every child is safe. This is the final, enduring truth of the Yates tragedy, and it is the legacy that we carry forward, each of us, as we continue to work toward the promise of a more compassionate, more vigilant, and more humane world. The story of the children is the story of our future, and it is a story that we are all, every day, writing together. The final chapter of this profound and harrowing narrative is not a closing of the case, but a permanent integration of its lessons into the architecture of our societal empathy. As we stand at the threshold of the future, the legacy of the Yates tragedy continues to serve as an enduring, silent compass, guiding our efforts to reconcile the complexities of severe psychiatric illness with the fundamental requirement of human protection. The story has moved from the initial, visceral shock of the courtroom to the more deliberate, reflective space of historical analysis, yet its power to unsettle, to inform, and to compel us toward change remains undiminished. We have come to recognize that the story is not a static event confined to a summer morning in 2001, but a living, evolving cautionary tale that forces us, time and time again, to confront the limitations of our institutions and the potential for total systemic failure when vigilance is replaced by complacency. The children, Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary, reside now in the center of our collective consciousness, not as ghosts of a crime, but as the enduring, quiet figures of a mission. Every systemic improvement in the way we track, support, and care for mothers navigating the high-risk periods of postpartum transition is a testament to their continued influence on the world. We have learned that the protection of the family is not a passive endeavor. It requires an active, sustained, and deeply informed commitment from the entire society. It requires us to abandon the illusion that the domestic sphere is an autonomous fortress, recognizing instead that it is a space that relies heavily on the health and stability of the infrastructure that surrounds it. When we fail to maintain that infrastructure, we leave families vulnerable to forces they are ill-equipped to combat, and the price of that failure is, as we have seen, the most devastating imaginable. In the years since the trial, the understanding of perinatal psychiatry has undergone a profound transformation. We have moved toward a model of care that prioritizes early detection and continuous longitudinal support, moving away from the reactive, crisis-driven responses that define the era leading up to the tragedy. This shift is a direct reflection of the lessons extracted from the rubble of the Yates home. It is an acknowledgement that postpartum psychosis is a medical emergency, a physiological reality that manifests through the brain's chemistry and demands the same immediate, expert, and comprehensive treatment as any other life-threatening condition. The integration of this perspective into the standard of care for obstetric and psychiatric practice is perhaps the most significant, life-saving legacy of this entire narrative. It ensures that the signs of distress, those subtle, critical warning indicators, are no longer ignored, but are instead treated as the vital, actionable data they are. Furthermore, the legal evolution that followed the second trial has fundamentally altered how we engage with the concept of the insanity defense in the face of severe mental impairment. The shift toward a more rigorous, expert-driven assessment of cognitive and moral capacity during episodes of profound psychosis has provided a necessary nuance to the justice system. It has allowed for the recognition that human behavior, when driven by a total loss of reality, cannot always be parsed through the binary lenses of traditional criminality. This evolution is not an attempt to diminish the gravity of the outcomes, but an attempt to maintain the integrity of justice by ensuring that the law accurately reflects the complexities of human biology and the realities of severe disease. It is a refinement of the judicial process that seeks to align our legal standards with our advancing, evidence-based understanding of the mind. The emotional and psychological aftermath for the community, for the professionals involved, and for the public who followed the story from afar has been equally transformative. We have moved from a place of simple, reflexive condemnation to a place of deeper, more contemplative sorrow. We have learned to sit with the ambiguity of the situation, recognizing the pain of the victims and the profound, catastrophic nature of the perpetrator's illness simultaneously. This ability to hold such complex, conflicting emotions is a sign of our maturation as a society. It indicates that we are becoming more capable of navigating the shades of gray that define human existence, allowing us to build a more nuanced, more supportive, and more humane world. The tragedy has demanded this of us, and the continued existence of the discourse around it shows that we are, in some vital way, rising to that demand. As we continue to build upon this foundation, we must remain aware that the progress we have made is not a guarantee of security, but a commitment to constant, proactive effort. The tragedy of the Yates family is a reminder that the shadows of mental illness are ever present, and that our institutions must be prepared to meet them with the light of knowledge, the strength of support, and the commitment of continuous, vigilant care. We must not allow the passage of time to dampen the urgency of our reform efforts. We must continue to educate, to advocate, and to refine the systems that keep our families safe. We must keep the story of the children alive, not as a point of morbidity, but as a point of focus, a point that sharpens our attention to the needs of the vulnerable and strengthens our resolve to prevent the preventable. The story ends here, but the work continues in the real world, in the hospitals, in the homes, and in the hearts of those who carry the memory of what was lost. We are the stewards of this history, and it is our obligation to ensure that the memory of the past serves to illuminate the path forward. We do this by valuing the humanity in every person, by being present for those who are struggling, and by demanding that our systems of care, justice, and community support are as robust, as compassionate, and as protective as they possibly can be. The children are the reason we strive for this, and their memory is the standard by which we measure our progress. We owe it to them to never be satisfied, to never be complacent, and to always, without hesitation, act to protect the lives that are entrusted to our care. This final, extended reflection on the Andrea Yates case is, in essence, a call to continued action. It is a recognition that the tragedy of 2001 is a permanent feature of our landscape, a feature that defines our understanding of what can happen and, consequently, what must be prevented. We are empowered by the knowledge that we have gained, and we are obligated by the memory of the lives that were taken. We move forward with a deeper understanding, a stronger resolve, and a permanent, quiet dedication to the sanctity of life and the crucial importance of the work we do to support one another through the darkest of times. The story, in all its sorrow and all its profound consequence, is now a part of us. It has changed us, it has challenged us, and it has compelled us to be better. We carry this forward, and in doing so, we ensure that the light of the lost children continues to guide us toward a safer, more vigilant, and more humane future for every family. The narrative of the Yates tragedy, with all its painful, necessary truth, is our constant, enduring reminder of why we must never stop, why we must never look away, and why we must, above all else, always strive to care for the vulnerable among us with the absolute, unwavering dedication that every single life demands and deserves. The journey of understanding is complete, but the journey of healing and of preventative care is a permanent, daily endeavor that we are all, each in our own way, a vital part of. We proceed with the weight of the past and the hope of the future, always held together by the memory of those who were lost and the shared, quiet, and profound commitment to do better for all who remain. The culmination of our examination of the Andrea Yates case brings us to a space of quiet, reflective finality, where the raw data of history meets the enduring necessity of human conscience. We have meticulously traced the trajectory of this tragedy, from the earliest manifestations of untreated psychiatric distress to the catastrophic events of that June morning in Houston, and finally, through the complex, painful, and transformative legal and societal aftermath. What remains is a narrative that stands as a stark monument to the fragility of the human mind and the critical, non-negotiable importance of the structures we build to protect one another. We have navigated the darkness of the delusions that consumed a mother, the structural failures that allowed those delusions to go unchecked, and the systemic shifts that have since been implemented to prevent such a total collapse from occurring again. This journey has not been one of idle curiosity, but one of essential, hard-won understanding. The tragedy of the 5 children, Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary, is an anchor that keeps our focus on the reality of the stakes involved in our collective approach to mental health. Their lives, while extinguished far too soon, continue to occupy a central, vital place in the discourse surrounding the safety of the domestic sphere. We have come to recognize that their loss was not an isolated incident of aberrant behavior, but a convergence of factors that society is now better equipped to identify and mitigate. By engaging with this history, we have contributed to a culture that is more aware, more vigilant, and more deeply committed to the principles of proactive, compassionate care. The transformation of our institutions, from the way we screen for perinatal mental health to the way we adjudicate the intersection of pathology and accountability, is the most tangible manifestation of this commitment. As we look toward the horizon of the future, we carry with us the heavy, essential burden of this knowledge. We recognize that the fight for better mental health is not a battle that is ever truly won. It is a permanent, daily endeavor that requires the participation and awareness of every member of our society. It requires us to cultivate environments where vulnerability is not met with judgment, but with immediate, skilled, and unwavering support. It requires us to dismantle the remaining barriers, the lingering stigmas, the gaps in access to care, and the failures in communication that still stand between individuals in crisis and the help they so desperately need. The Andrea Yates case acts as an eternal sentinel, warning us against the dangers of complacency and reminding us that our collective responsibility for one another's well-being is the most significant, meaningful dimension of our social contract. The philosophical resolution of this narrative lies in our acknowledgement of the inherent tension that exists between individual responsibility and societal duty. We have learned that these two concepts are not mutually exclusive, but are instead profoundly interdependent. While a person is responsible for their health and their actions, society is responsible for providing the environment, the resources, and the support that make health and responsible action possible. When that environment is lacking, when the support systems are disconnected, and when the signs of distress are allowed to wither in the shadows, the resulting consequences are the shared, collective burden of us all. The Yates tragedy forces us to accept this burden, to internalize the lesson that our indifference is often as destructive as our active negligence. Furthermore, we must honor the resilience of the human spirit that emerges from such darkness. The ability of the professional communities, the doctors, the lawyers, the researchers, and the advocates, to study, to learn, and to implement change in the face of such profound sorrow is a testament to our capacity for progress. We have taken a deeply painful chapter and turned it into an instrument of prevention and enlightenment. We have turned a moment of total failure into an opportunity for the construction of stronger, more responsive, and more humane systems of intervention. This is the ultimate, redemptive arc of the narrative. Not the restoration of what was lost, but the creation of a more vigilant, prepared, and supportive world for those who remain. The legacy of these proceedings is also found in the quiet, ongoing dedication of those who continue to work in the field of mental health. They are the ones who show up, day after day, to provide the support that can change the trajectory of a person's life. They are the ones who listen to the subtle, hidden signals of distress and provide the pathways to stability. Their work is the silent, essential engine of our progress, and it is fueled by the lessons learned from the very tragedies that have challenged us the most. We owe it to them to continue providing the resources, the social support, and the commitment that their work requires. We owe it to them to ensure that the systemic support for the family unit remains a primary, unquestioned priority in our societal planning. As we finally step away from this deep, decade-spanning analysis, we do so with a renewed, sharpened sense of purpose. We acknowledge that the story is complex, that the loss is irreparable, and that the questions it raises are as profound as they are unsettling. Yet, we also acknowledge that our engagement with this story has left us better equipped to face the future. We are more aware of the signs, more attuned to the vulnerabilities, and more resolute in our commitment to protect the lives that are entrusted to our care. The memory of the children remains the guiding star of this commitment, a constant reminder of the reason we must never stop striving for excellence in our care and our understanding. In the final estimation, the story of the Yates family is a story about the vital necessity of human connection. It is about the power of reaching out, the importance of listening, and the life-saving impact of showing up for one another in times of need. It is a story that proves, in the most devastating of ways, that isolation is the enemy of safety and that community is the architect of survival. As we move forward, we carry this understanding with us, integrating it into the way we live our lives, the way we treat our neighbors, and the way we advocate for a more supportive, more compassionate world. The tragedy has left an indelible mark, but it has also provided an indelible lesson that our protection of one another is the ultimate, defining act of our humanity. We conclude this exploration not with a sense of closure, for such a tragedy never truly closes, but with a sense of resolve. We have done the work of witnessing, of analyzing, and of reflecting, and in doing so, we have honored the lives that were lost by ensuring their story contributes to the safety and the well-being of others. The legacy is established, the lessons are documented, and the path forward is illuminated by the shared, collective commitment to a future where such a total, devastating failure is no longer possible. We proceed with the knowledge that we have gained, the responsibility that we have accepted, and the profound, enduring dedication to the sanctity of life that this story has awakened within us all. This is the conclusion of our work, the final chapter of our reflection, and the beginning of our sustained, ongoing commitment to a more vigilant, a more understanding, and a more protective society. The memory of the Yates tragedy lives on, not as a source of despair, but as a source of strength, a source of guidance, and a source of the shared, human resolve to keep our families, our children, and our communities safe from the shadows that can claim them when we fail to act with the compassion and the care that we all, as members of a common humanity, so deeply and universally deserve. The mission remains, the vigilance continues, and the promise of a safer world is one that we are all, every day, working to keep, honoring the lost children by protecting the lives that are still here to be nurtured, shielded, and loved.